The cold metal of the truck bed vibrated beneath Klaus Hoffmann's palms as he steadied himself against the jolting ride. Around him, a dozen German prisoners of war huddled in identical postures, their eyes darting nervously toward the 4 American guards who sat among them, rifles balanced casually across their knees. What struck Klaus wasn't the bumpy journey through the Pennsylvania countryside, nor the handcuffs that had been removed just minutes before boarding. It was the simple fact that these enemy soldiers, these Americans whom propaganda had portrayed as vengeful barbarians, were sitting shoulder to shoulder with their captives, sharing cigarettes, and occasionally pointing out landmarks through gaps in the canvas covering. "This is the Susquehanna River," one guard said in halting German, gesturing toward a wide expanse of water glimpsed through a tear in the truck's side. "My grandfather fished here before the war." Klaus exchanged glances with Werner Bauer, his former lieutenant from the Afrika Korps. Both men had been captured during the final days of the Tunisia campaign, expecting execution or, at minimum, brutal treatment. Instead, they found themselves treated almost as passengers rather than prisoners, occupying the same transport as their captors, breathing the same air, viewing the same scenery. In the Reich's military, prisoners were transported in closed boxcars or forced to march under constant threat. Here, Americans seemed unconcerned about maintaining rigid separation. "Why do they allow us to ride with them?" whispered Werner, his voice barely audible above the engine's rumble. "Is it a trick to lower our guard?" Klaus had no answer, only questions that multiplied with each passing mile. Had everything they'd been told about American savagery been propaganda? If their enemies showed such casual confidence even in transporting dangerous prisoners, what did that reveal about the true balance of power in this war? As the truck rounded a bend, revealing a small town gleaming with unrationed electric lights, Klaus realized that this simple ride was just the first contradiction in a journey that would fundamentally challenge everything he thought he knew about his captors, his country, and the war itself. The prisoners had boarded the transport ships in North Africa with dread pooling in their stomachs. Tales circulated among German ranks of Allied brutality, stories of beatings, starvation, and humiliation awaiting anyone unfortunate enough to be captured. Klaus remembered his commanding officer's final words before surrender. "They will treat you worse than animals. Better to die fighting." Yet their reception on American soil had defied every grim expectation. The processing center in New York had been orderly, almost clinical. No one was struck or spat upon. They were registered, photographed, examined by doctors, deloused, and given new clothing, all with an efficiency that would have impressed even the most disciplined German quartermaster. The prisoners received 3 meals a day, simple but filling, with portions that seemed extravagant compared to what many had eaten in the final desperate months in North Africa. When the time came to transfer them to permanent camps scattered across America's vast interior, Klaus expected the humiliation to begin. Surely now they would be packed into cattle cars or chained in open trucks, exposed to the elements and public ridicule. Such treatment would align with everything the Reich had told them about democratic weakness giving way to vengeance when victory seemed assured. Instead, the Americans loaded them into standard military transport vehicles, the same ones used for their own troops. Guards climbed aboard, sitting directly among the prisoners. There were no separate compartments, no physical barriers beyond watchful eyes and ready rifles. German officers, stripped of insignia, but still commanding respect from their men, received no special indignity nor privilege. They sat on the same wooden benches as private soldiers, transported in the same vehicles as their captors. They must be short on trucks, reasoned Hermann Schmidt, a tank mechanic from Dusseldorf. Perhaps they cannot spare vehicles just for prisoners. But as they traveled deeper into the American heartland, passing countless military convoys and witnessing the seemingly endless stream of vehicles, this explanation grew less convincing. America appeared to have no shortage of anything, not fuel, not vehicles, not supplies. This shared transportation wasn't born of necessity, but seemed instead a matter of practical efficiency, perhaps even policy. Klaus observed how the American guards operated with a relaxed alertness that confounded German expectations. They were vigilant, but not tense, watching but rarely threatening. They spoke among themselves, and occasionally to prisoners who understood English, pointing out towns or geographic features as though conducting a peculiar sightseeing tour. One guard even shared his canteen when a prisoner looked particularly parched, an act of humanity that would have earned a German soldier punishment had he shown similar kindness to enemy captives. As the truck convoy paused at a roadside stop, something even more surprising occurred. The prisoners watched as Americans refueled their vehicles with casual abundance, pumping gasoline without carefully measuring each drop. Back in Germany, fuel had become so precious that vehicles often stood idle, and tanks sometimes entered battle with barely enough diesel for the engagement. Here, America's legendary production capacity was not just propaganda. It was tangible reality, flowing from pump to truck in a steady stream. What perplexed Klaus most was the strange contradiction. These Americans, supposedly soft from democracy and individualism, showed not weakness but a different kind of strength, one born of confidence rather than fear. They didn't need to terrorize their prisoners because they possessed something far more powerful than brutality, the absolute certainty of their eventual victory. As the trucks rumbled onward toward Camp Atterbury in Indiana, Klaus glimpsed through canvas flaps a countryside untouched by bombing. Farms operating at full capacity, and factories belching smoke on the horizons. The America passing before his eyes bore no resemblance to the crumbling, chaotic nation described in German newspapers. What other lies had they been told? This question haunted him as the convoy pressed deeper into the American heartland, where greater revelations awaited. The arrival at Camp Atterbury brought another wave of disorienting contradictions. Instead of being forced to stumble from the trucks after a grueling journey, the prisoners were allowed to descend at their own pace. Guards stood at relaxed attention, directing rather than shoving. Water was provided immediately. Again, the expected humiliation never materialized. The camp itself surprised them. Rows of wooden barracks with windows and proper roofs, surrounded by fences and guard towers, but otherwise resembling military installations rather than punishment centers. The processing line moved with calm efficiency. Each man received bedding, toiletries, and a handbook explaining camp regulations, printed in German with detailed illustrations. "This handbook says we will receive mail from home," whispered Otto Lehmann, a former schoolteacher drafted into infantry service, "and that we may send 2 letters per month. Is this possible?" Klaus didn't answer, still struggling to reconcile these humane conditions with years of conditioning. Something fundamental didn't align. If Americans were the barbaric mongrels described by Nazi propaganda, why this orderly, almost respectful treatment? The Reich had insisted that democratic societies lacked discipline, that their multicultural populations could never unite effectively. Yet everything Klaus witnessed suggested otherwise. That evening in the mess hall, the prisoners received their most profound shock yet. The portions were generous by wartime standards: meat, potatoes, bread, and even a small piece of chocolate. But more surprising was the revelation that they would eat the same food as the American guards, prepared in the same kitchens, served in the same style. The Geneva Convention mandated equal rations, but Klaus had never expected this regulation to be followed so meticulously. "In Russia," murmured Werner between careful bites, "our army fed Soviet prisoners potato peels and sawdust bread, if they were fed at all. I saw men fighting over rats in the compounds." The other prisoners ate in silence, each wrestling with the same uncomfortable thoughts. How could they reconcile their indoctrination about American inferiority with these experiences? If their captors treated enemies with such unexpected humanity, what did that suggest about the moral claims underpinning the entire war? Their first night in the permanent camp, Klaus lay awake on his bunk, a real bunk with a mattress, not straw or bare boards, listening to the sounds of America. In the distance, a train whistle signaled the uninterrupted flow of industrial might. Crickets chirped beneath the barracks. From the guards' quarters came faint radio music. Glenn Miller, Klaus recognized, having secretly listened to forbidden, degenerate American jazz before the war. The night sounds of a nation at war, yet fundamentally at peace with itself, untouched by bombing or privation. That night, Klaus began to understand that the shared truck rides weren't merely logistical convenience. They were a manifestation of something deeper, a society so confident in its strength that it could afford small courtesies even toward enemies. This realization planted the first seed of doubt about everything he had been taught to believe. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to camp life that further eroded preconceptions. Every morning, prisoners and guards alike stood for roll call under the rising sun. The Americans performed their counts efficiently, without unnecessary harassment. Prisoners were assigned work details, kitchen duty, laundry, groundskeeping, all paid according to the Geneva Convention with camp scrip that could purchase items at the commissary. Klaus found himself assigned to the motor pool, where the trucks that had transported them were maintained and repaired. Here, the contrast between German and American approaches became even more apparent. While Reich vehicles were marvels of engineering, they required specialized parts and skilled mechanics. American trucks were simpler, more standardized, and designed for quick repair even by relatively untrained personnel. "Look at this engine," marveled Hans Gruber, a former mechanic from Hamburg who worked alongside Klaus. 6 cylinders, enormous displacement, but so simple any farmer could fix it with basic tools. And the parts, every truck uses the same components.
In Deutschland, wir hatten Dutzende verschiedener Modelle, jedes erforderlich unique Parts. Der Motorsergeant, ein stockiger Mann von Nebraska namens Wilson, oversah der Werk mit professionellem Interesse, rein weniger zu Suspicion. Er sprach kein Deutsch, aber kommunizierte durch Gesten und den Universallangweilig der Engines. Wenn Klaus Axelles successvoll einen Karburatorenproblem fand, Wilson nordete mit genuinem Approval und later brachte ihm Kaffee von den Guardspot, nicht den weniger Brühe serviert zu Prisonern. Das ist wie sie winnen, Hans wisperte, als sie benäht einem 6x6-Transport wisperte. Nicht nur mit Quantität, sondern mit Praktikalität. Deren Trucks sind nicht beautiful oder perfekt, aber sie werken und, wenn sie brechen, sie können quicklich fixen. Die Amerikaners' casual coincidence extended beyond their vehicles. Guards changed shifts mit Clockwork-Präzision, deren Uniformen clean, aber oft worn mit einer relaxter Interpretation von Regulations, das würde horrorisiert haben German officers.
They chewed gum, smoked constantly, and addressed each other by first names when officers weren't present. Yet behind this informality lay undeniable effectiveness. "They seem undisciplined," observed Werner one evening, as they watched guards playing baseball during off hours. "But have you noticed? The fences are always manned. The patrols never late. The supplies always arrive on schedule." Klaus had indeed noticed. It was a different kind of discipline, one that accomplished its objectives without the rigid formality German military culture demanded. The recognition was unsettling. If these undisciplined Americans could organize prison camps with such efficiency, what did that suggest about their war machine as a whole? Most revealing were the transport operations. Prisoners were frequently moved between camps or taken to work sites on nearby farms. Each time, they rode in the same trucks as their guards, sitting side by side or face to face. This practice never changed, suggesting it wasn't an aberration, but standard procedure. The message was subtle but clear. America had so many trucks, so much fuel, so much confidence, that it saw no need to create separate transport systems for captives. In Germany, Klaus found himself thinking, we would never waste precious vehicles on prisoner comfort. Every truck would be at the front, carrying ammunition, not shuttling enemies in relative comfort. One afternoon in early autumn, Klaus found himself repairing a truck's brake line when Captain Reynolds, the camp's transport officer, approached. The American watched silently for several minutes before speaking. "You know your way around vehicles, Hoffman," he said, consulting a clipboard with prisoner records. "You were a mechanic before the war." "Yes, sir," Klaus replied cautiously, "for Mercedes-Benz in Stuttgart." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "We're short on qualified mechanics. Would you be willing to take on more responsibility in the motor pool? Same camp script as your current position, but you'd help supervise maintenance schedules. Klaus hesitated, uncertain if accepting would be seen as collaboration by his fellow prisoners. But the practical reality was undeniable. Working with engines was preferable to digging drainage ditches or peeling potatoes. He agreed. In his new role, Klaus gained insights into the American logistical system that left him increasingly uncertain about Germany's chances in the war. Each week, supply trucks arrived with clockwork reliability, bringing everything from spare parts to fresh food. Fuel was never in short supply. Even more telling were the maintenance records Klaus now reviewed, revealing the staggering scale of America's motor transport capacity. Camp Atterbury alone has 127 operational vehicles, he told Werner one night in hushed tones. And this is just a prisoner camp, not even a combat unit. How many trucks must their entire army have? The answer, though neither man said it aloud, was obvious. Far more than Germany could ever hope to match, especially as Allied bombing increasingly targeted Reich factories and fuel supplies. Klaus recalled how during the North Africa campaign, German units had been forced to capture British vehicles just to remain mobile. Here, Americans had trucks to spare for shuttling prisoners between work details. The shared transport experience took on new meaning with each passing month. It wasn't merely convenience. It was a constant, subtle demonstration of overwhelming industrial superiority. Every time prisoners and guards rode together in the same vehicle, the message was reinforced. America had resources to spare. "Have you noticed," asked Hans after returning from a farm work detail, "that they never seem worried about fuel? Our trucks in Russia had to shut off engines whenever possible to conserve diesel. Here, they leave vehicles idling during breaks." Klaus had noticed, just as he'd noticed how guards received packages from home containing chocolates, cigarettes, and canned goods, luxuries that had vanished from German civilian life years ago. The contrast was impossible to ignore, especially for men who had experienced the increasing privation of the Reich's wartime economy. One incident crystallized the difference more clearly than any other. During a thunderstorm, a tree fell across the camp access road, temporarily blocking supply deliveries. Within hours, American engineers arrived with a bulldozer, chainsaws, and a crew of workers who cleared the obstacle as if it were a minor inconvenience. Klaus, watching from the motor pool, remembered how in Germany, such equipment would have been precious, reserved for military operations. Here, it was dispatched without hesitation to solve a simple logistical problem. "They have so much of everything," he murmured to himself. "How did we ever think we could win?" The question lingered, growing more insistent as the prisoners were exposed to more evidence of America's overwhelming capacity. Newspapers allowed in the camp reported production figures that seemed fantasy. Thousands of aircraft each month, millions of tons of shipping, endless streams of tanks and vehicles. Even accounting for propaganda exaggeration, the scale was staggering. For Klaus and his fellow prisoners, the shared truck rides became a metaphor for the wider war. Sitting side by side with the power that would inevitably prevail, watching America's abundance scroll past through canvas openings. With each journey, another piece of their former certainty crumbled. One December morning, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks for transport to a new work detail. Snow dusted the landscape, and the metal truck beds were bitter cold. Klaus expected to shiver through the journey, as he would have in a German transport. Instead, the guards distributed blankets, not just to themselves, but to the prisoners as well. "Can't have you freezing before we get there," explained a sergeant matter-of-factly. "Nobody works well with frostbite." It was a small gesture, pragmatic rather than sentimental. Yet it highlighted once again the fundamental difference in approach. The Reich worked its prisoners to death because human life was expendable in its ideology. America kept its prisoners healthy because waste, even of enemy labor, was inefficient in its system. That afternoon, as their truck convoy passed through a small Indiana town, children waited at a crossroads to watch the vehicles. Klaus tensed, expecting jeers or thrown stones, the natural response to enemy soldiers. Instead, the children simply waved at the passing trucks, making no distinction between guards and prisoners. Some guards waved back. One even tossed candy to the children. "They don't hate us," whispered Otto, watching the scene with bewilderment. "Their children don't even know to hate us." The observation struck Klaus profoundly. In Germany, hatred for enemies had been carefully cultivated, taught in schools and youth organizations. Here, even with sons and brothers dying in Europe, America hadn't needed to foster the same consuming hatred. Its strength came from elsewhere. That evening, returning to camp in the gathering dusk, Klaus watched as guard and prisoner alike dozed against the swaying truck walls, separated only by uniform and circumstance, not by physical barriers or elaborate security. The shared transport, which had initially seemed so strange, now appeared to him as the perfect symbol of America's war approach. Practical, efficient, confident, and ultimately humane, not from weakness, but from strength. For men raised under National Socialism, this realization created profound internal conflict. Their entire worldview had been constructed around notions of German superiority, democratic weakness, and the need for ruthless strength. Yet here they encountered an enemy whose power derived from systems and values fundamentally opposite to those the Reich championed. How could the supposedly inferior system produce such abundance? How could the mongrel nation organize with such effectiveness? How could democratic individualism generate such overwhelming collective might? These questions haunted the prisoners' conversations, whispered in barracks after lights out. For Klaus, the crisis of faith deepened when he was assigned to a special maintenance detail working on vehicles damaged in training accidents. These wrecked trucks and jeeps, rather than being painstakingly repaired as they would have been in resource-starved Germany, were often cannibalized for usable parts and the remainder sent for scrap recycling. America could afford to replace rather than repair, a luxury unimaginable in the Reich. "They build new vehicles faster than they can wear out the old ones," Hans observed, as they stripped a salvageable transmission, "while we're patching together our last reserves." The logical conclusion remained unspoken but understood. Germany could not possibly win against such productive capacity, which meant that thousands of their comrades were still dying for a cause already lost. This realization affected different prisoners in different ways. Some, like Werner, retreated into stubborn denial, insisting that secret weapons or strategy would still deliver victory. Others, like Otto, sank into depression as they confronted the futility of their sacrifice. Klaus found himself in a third category, increasingly curious about the American system that had generated such overwhelming strength. He began asking careful questions of guards willing to converse. How were American factories organized? How did their supply chains function? How did a democracy coordinate such massive production without central control? The answers, though filtered through the limited knowledge of individual soldiers, painted a picture of a society organized around principles of efficiency, standardization, and individual initiative rather than ideological purity. One revelation came from an unexpected source. Sergeant Wilson, the motor pool supervisor, received a letter from his brother working at the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan. Knowing Klaus's interest in industrial matters, he shared a staggering statistic. The factory was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes on a mile-long assembly line. "One bomber every hour," Klaus repeated in disbelief to his fellow prisoners that night. "While our aircraft factories are bombed into rubble, they build flying fortresses like automobiles." The comparison to automobiles was apt. Before the war, Klaus had worked at Mercedes, where each vehicle was essentially handcrafted compared to American mass production techniques. That fundamental difference in industrial philosophy now played out on the global stage with devastating consequences for Germany. Spring arrived, bringing news of Allied advances on all fronts. The camp atmosphere changed subtly as reality set in. Even the most devoted Nazi supporters among the prisoners grew quieter, less certain in their declarations of eventual victory. The shared truck rides continued, a constant reminder of America's casual confidence, its unshakable material superiority. During one such transport to a farm work detail, Klaus found himself seated directly opposite a young guard from Ohio. The American was reading a letter, his expression shifting between smiles and concern. Noticing Klaus's gaze, he unexpectedly explained. "My wife had our baby," he said, showing a small photograph. "Boy named Robert, 7 pounds, 8 ounces. Klaus offered congratulations, surprised by the personal connection. The guard continued. "She says rationing is a pain. Can't get enough sugar or coffee sometimes," he chuckled. "Tough for them back home." The casual remark illustrated another reality gap. In Germany, civilian rationing meant slow starvation. Children received increasingly meager milk allotments. Meat had virtually disappeared from ordinary tables. Here, rationing meant inconvenience, not deprivation. That afternoon, as they worked in fields stretching to the horizon, Klaus watched American bombers flying in formation overhead, not in combat, but clearly on a training mission, precious fuel being expended simply to practice. The contrast with Germany's desperate fuel conservation, with planes grounded for lack of gasoline, could not have been more stark. Riding back to camp that evening, prisoners and guards alike gazed at the metal birds tracing contrails across the sky. For the Americans, they represented protection. For the Germans, doom. Yet they shared the same trucks, breathed the same dust, watched the same sunset. The war's outcome was increasingly obvious to both. Klaus's transformation wasn't dramatic, but gradual, a quiet erosion of certainties rather than a sudden conversion. He didn't reject his German identity, but he increasingly questioned the ideology that had driven his nation to war. The shared truck rides, once shocking in their contradiction of expected treatment, now seemed emblematic of a different way of organizing society, one based on practical effectiveness rather than rigid hierarchy. As Germany's collapse accelerated through summer and fall, the prisoners received news through approved newspapers and radio broadcasts. Some refused to believe reports of Reich territories falling, of Hitler's bunker existence, of devastation across German cities. But most, including Klaus, accepted the inevitable. Their experience of American might, witnessed daily in 1,000 small ways, from truck maintenance schedules to mess hall provisions, had prepared them for this outcome. The final revelation came in May 1945, when news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the camp. That evening, an extraordinary scene unfolded. The camp commander arranged for trucks to transport prisoners to a nearby field where they could hold a private ceremony to mourn their nation's defeat. Guards and prisoners rode together as always, but now in a shared silence that acknowledged both victory and loss. At the field, the prisoners were allowed to stand in formation, to sing traditional songs, to experience their grief collectively. The guards maintained a respectful distance, neither celebrating nor interfering. When the ceremony concluded, all returned to the same trucks for the journey back to camp. Klaus found himself seated beside Captain Reynolds, the transport officer who had promoted him in the motor pool. As the truck rumbled through gathering darkness, Reynolds spoke quietly. "What will you do when you return to Germany, Hoffman?" Klaus considered the question. "Rebuild, if anything remains to rebuild." Reynolds nodded. "You have skills, we've seen here. Remember what you've learned." The conversation fell silent. But Klaus understood the message. He had learned more than engine repair during his captivity. He had witnessed a system that functioned on principles of standardization, efficiency, and practical problem-solving, rather than ideology and force. These lessons would prove invaluable in the shattered post-war Germany. In the final months before repatriation, as Europe settled into uneasy peace, the camp routine continued. Prisoners and guards still shared the same trucks on work details, ate similar food, breathed the same air. What had once seemed shocking now appeared normal, a small daily reminder that humanity could persist even between enemies. Klaus's last ride in an American truck came in January 1946. The prisoners were transported to a processing center for return to occupied Germany. As always, they sat among their guards, separated only by uniform and circumstance. The trucks moved in convoy through a landscape untouched by bombing, past factories still producing at capacity, beneath skies untroubled by air raids. As the processing center appeared on the horizon, Klaus realized that this final shared journey summarized everything he had learned during captivity. America's strength had never been primarily in weapons, but in systems, in the ability to produce trucks in such abundance that prisoners could ride comfortably alongside captors, in fuel supplies so plentiful that vehicles never stood idle, in an industrial base so secure that production continued at full capacity even as victory was achieved. Years later, working as a supervisor at a revitalized Mercedes plant in Stuttgart, Klaus would implement production techniques he had first observed in America. Standardization, assembly flow, interchangeable parts, principles that helped drive Germany's economic miracle. Occasionally, when company trucks transported workers between facilities, he would remember those first shared rides as a prisoner, when the simple act of sitting alongside guards had revealed a different way of organizing society. The lesson was never just about trucks or transport or even industrial capacity. It was about the power of practical effectiveness over rigid ideology, of systems designed for results rather than control. This understanding, carried home by thousands of prisoners who had experienced America's casual confidence firsthand, would help transform Germany from shattered enemy to prosperous ally within a single generation. Perhaps somewhere in America today, a grandfather tells stories of guarding German prisoners, of riding alongside former enemies in olive-drab trucks through the Indiana countryside. And perhaps in Germany, former prisoners remember the shock of their first transport on American soil, not separated, not humiliated, but simply moved with practical efficiency from place to place. In those shared journeys across an untouched American landscape, the seeds of a different future were planted, one where former enemies could eventually travel the same road toward shared prosperity and lasting peace. What other moments of unexpected humanity shaped the aftermath of humanity's darkest conflict, waiting to be discovered in the quiet spaces between the war's thunderous chapters?